The movie opens up by a quite famous man called Steve Jobs walks up on stage at the Apple Town Hall in 2001 for a staff meeting. He tells them that Johnny himself and a small team has developed a secret device that will revolutionize the entire music industry. Steve explains it's a tool for the heart with which you can have 1,000 songs in your pocket. And as he picks it up and shows them the iPod, people make a standing ovation. 27 years earlier, Steve meets his friend Daniel at Reed College. He explains to Daniel he doesn't want to study because a system can only produce a system which he doesn't want to be part of. The teacher confronts them and wants to talk to Steve, asking if he's interested in taking an electrical engineering degree. But Steve says it's a waste of his time and money and that it's only for people who want job security. He walks up to a girl and comments her work is beautiful, and she introduces herself as Julie. Next, the two have slept together, and Julie offers him some drugs, and Steve asks if he can get a couple to give his girlfriend. Later, he is with his girlfriend Chrisanne and his friend Daniel, out in nature, being influenced by drugs. Suddenly, Steve starts hallucinating and begins hearing music, and goes out into a field. He becomes inspired, and starts visioning what he will do next. In the following weeks, he goes to calligraphy classes to learn form and precision, and to classes about computers to learn computer programming and engineering. His friend Daniel goes to meditation classes, and Steve joins him. Inspired by the Indian culture, the two travel to India together to learn the concept of becoming happy by living an uncomplicated and simple life. Daniel asks Steve what he will do when they return to the United States, but consumed by thought, Steve doesn't answer him. 2 years later, Steve works at Atari, developing games. He yells at a fellow employee that he can't design stuff, and then yells to the people at the company they can't design anything. His boss says people are complaining about his behavior and his odor, asking if he has showered lately. He tells Steve he wants him there because he's really good, but explains that he's an asshole. Steve asks if he can get his own project, saying he will make the best damn game he's ever seen. His boss accepts and promises a payment of $5,000 if he can deliver. Steve is working at night and is struggling. He calls his friend Wozniak, who gladly helps him, saying he loves this kind of job. Wozniak asks what they are paid, and Steve lies, saying $700, which Wozniak thinks is great. Next, Steve's boss is ecstatic. Steve comes home to Wozniak and gives him $350 for the work. Suddenly, Steve sees a device and asks Wozniak what it is. Wozniak says it will be very cool when finished, explaining he's developing and programming a computer terminal board that he's plugged into the TV. Wozniak tells Steve it, in theory, will display anything you are working on. As he is shown how it works, he becomes totally hooked on the invention. Steve later explains this is the wheel, it's the Industrial Revolution. He says that to see what you're working on while you're working on it, that's freedom. Wozniak responds he's overreacting and that people don't want computers. Steve then asks rhetorically, how does somebody know what they want if they've never even seen it? Steve forces Wozniak to present it at Homebrew. Wozniak says they need a name for the computer, and after several ideas, Steve suddenly says Apple. It's simple but sophisticated, and it comes high up in the phone book. Apple. The fruit, the simple but sophisticated, comes before it's hard in the phone book. Apple? Really? Apple? Come up with something better? We'll change it. Wozniak is a bit unsure if it's good enough, but Steve says they should go with it and see if it sticks. Wozniak presents the computer board, but most of the audience seem uninterested. Steve runs out, but is stopped by a man outside called Paul, who saw their presentation and who wants to talk business. He asks Steve to come by his store to talk. The very next day, Steve goes to visit Paul in his store. He starts negotiating and ends up receiving an order of 50 computers for $500 each, paid at delivery. Paul wants the order in 90 days, but Steve promises to deliver in 60. He and Wozniak get to borrow his parents' garage for their shop. Just as Wozniak finishes the first board, Steve comments they must make it more symmetrical. Wozniak says they don't have time and that no one cares, but Steve replies he himself cares. Soon after, Steve has employed Daniel and 2 other people he knows. Wozniak tells him they can't afford to pay them, and Steve says they can't even pay themselves unless they deliver, which is much more likely if they get help. During the following 2 months, the team creates all the 50 computer boards. As they make their delivery, Paul says he ordered computers with keyboards and monitors included not just Steve says these are kick-ass computers, but then Paul explains people don't want to assemble their own computers. They want to just plug it in and have it work, and Steve takes note of this comment. Steve then promises the boards will sell and says he can sell the other parts separately, which will make him more money. Paul says he will try selling them, but if it doesn't work, he won't make another order. Steve says it's okay, but adds enigmatically he thinks he will be very interested in their second model. Next, Steve has asked an experienced engineer to help them, telling him they need to fit a board, power supply, and cooling system inside a very small box, and he agrees to help. Even though he thinks it's impossible, Steve begins making calls, trying to sell their ideas and products to companies, but no one seems to be interested. As Steve becomes angry at some of his employees for not working as hard as they could, a man in an expensive car pulls up outside their house. He asks if this is Apple Computers, which Steve confirms. The man introduces himself as Mike and then says a friend from Atari asked him to stop by and visit to see what they are doing. They begin talking, and Mike says he's been looking for something to sink his teeth into, and is willing to invest, thinking they are on to something big. He says he will begin investing $90,000, and Steve's friends are blown away, but Steve says it's not enough, saying he wants Mike to also kick in a $250,000 credit line with 10 interests that will be paid back in full at net revenue positive. Mike slowly says okay and agrees to his terms, shaking their hands. Next, his girlfriend Chrisanne tells Steve she is pregnant, and Steve reacts, saying she can't put this on him right now. As Chrisanne tries to say it's his child too, Steve yells it's not and tells her to get out of his house. Steve goes into a room and looks himself in the mirror, tucking his shirt into his jeans. Meanwhile, Chrisanne tells Daniel Steve is kicking her out, and Daniel assures her she has done nothing wrong, but that Steve has changed. A couple months later, Steve arrives at a computer fair, seemingly having changed, and Paul sees him. Everyone at the fair listens as Steve begins presenting. He introduces the Apple I to the world, which he says will revolutionize the PC market, and people start cheering. 3 years later, Steve arrives at his company. He explains to a team he's working with to create a computer called Lisa that they have to start over and make this interface revolutionary. One employee says Steve's ideas are not a pressing issue, and Steve yells at him that he is fired. Another employee says that the guy was the best programmer they had, and Steve replies he was the best programmer that doesn't share their vision. Later, Steve's lawyer asks Steve to sign a paper saying he's Lisa Brandon's father. Steve says he never had a child with Chrisanne, but after his attorney implores him to sign it, he does. Next, Wozniak asks Steve why he didn't give Daniel and the others any stock options in the company, and Steve responds his job is not to make people happy, but to make them better and that they do not deserve it. Wozniak shares that he once joined the company because building computers was his thing, and because he and the others thought it was cool. He tells Steve he has changed, and Steve says it's because he's growing up, but Wozniak replies he is not. The next day, Steve shaves his beard, and on the news, Apple Inc. is making headlines as 4.6 million shares were sold in the first hour of its IPO. As Steve arrives at work, people greet him with applause. Wozniak just answers. They both knew this would eventually happen. He comments he remembers back when they were just kids in his parents' garage, saying it has been a journey, and tells Steve that he loved what they created. As Steve gets to work early one day, he is surprised to see board members having a meeting without him. They tell him it's good he joins them this time, and Scully tells Steve he finds it difficult to do his work because of him accusing him of everything bad. At a board meeting a few days later, the board votes Steve Jobs out of the company. After Steve has left, they ask themselves what they will do now. Steve goes to his parents' home, taking a look in the garage, remembering Apple's humble beginnings, and his father comes and hugs him as he sheds a tear. Several years later, Apple's stock has eroded. Scully has been fired. New board members have joined Apple, and Steve's new computer company called Next has entered buyout talks with Apple. The year is 1996, and Steve is at home waking up his daughter Lisa. His new wife Lauren asks if he has plans today, and he answers Gil Amelio, the CEO of Apple, will stop by and they will talk a bit. As the two meet, Jill asks Steve what they can do to convince him to get back to Apple.